4 minutes after 10, you are listening to LBC with me, James O'Brien. And we will begin, I think, with... I haven't checked on Gary's maths, I have to confess. I have no reason to doubt him, but he's done a sum which I think roughly estimates how many people could conceivably be vaccinated in the course of this radio diversion. The 140 jabs a minute figure, which was... trumpeted quite rightly this weekend. I don't think it applies to every single, I think in some areas or some parts, but still, we'll take that win while we can. He reckons that 25,200 people could be vaccinated during the course of today's programme. So it's just great, isn't it? This idea of some sort of deliverance being on the horizon, underpinned somewhat horribly, of course, by the rampaging nature of the virus at the moment, but you can, I think, sustain both of those thoughts simultaneously. The vaccination programme is going well. The containment programme, or the coronavirus governmental strategy, has gone quite spectacularly, awfully, unparalleledly bad. But just because they messed everything up yesterday doesn't mean they will mess everything up tomorrow. And some little quibbles, well, I say little quibbles, I'm falling into the trap I normally berate you for living in, is believing what you want to believe rather than what is actually true. There are some apparently legitimate concerns about vaccine supply and some suggestions that they are once again over-promising, but you can only go with what's in front of you, and the numbers as it stands are spectacularly and splendiferously good. So well done, everybody. The numbers, of course, regarding new cases, most deaths and deaths per million of the population are the polar opposite. But as I say, if we are truly to dismantle the requirements of footballification together, if we are to return to distant times when we were capable of seeing things clearly rather than through the lens of often ludicrous political allegiances, then these are very good places to start, because we are truly all in it together. I've changed my mind about what we're going to start the programme with today. We will move on to Professor Jonathan Sumption's controversial comments this weekend about the value of human life. I want you to think on that, maybe do a little bit of swatting up before we turn our attention to it, because I don't think it's quite as brutal and as an unpleasant an intervention as it initially appears, but I could be wrong, and there are a couple of immediate ideas that popped into my head while I was not only patting myself on the back for deciding a long time ago to stop doing the studio-based ethical stroke moral discussion shows, because they do very, very rarely let much light in, but also thinking about how I apportion value to human life and wondering whether there is ever any sort of objective algorithm for it. I think it's pretty close to utilitarianism, what he said, which perhaps renders it a little less controversial than some of the coverage today allows. But it was listening to Nick, actually, and a couple of his callers that prompted me to think we'd go in slightly differently today, or that we wouldn't go in first on those comments. We'd go in instead on the story about universal credit and the strange, talk about footballification, the strange phenomenon or the strange prospect of Boris Johnson ordering his parliamentary party to abstain on a vote designed to support the extension of the poorest people in the country getting 20 quid a week more than they currently get, or continuing the award of 20 quid a week to them. Works out about £1,000 a year for what I think can be fairly described as the poorest families in the country. And I'll tell you what occurred to me listening to Nick. I'm conscious that this might make me sound awful, but I don't know what poor means in politics anymore. Some of the numbers that get bandied around in conversations like this, the idea of being expected to live on just north of £400 a week is, and I'm not going to apologise for this, but I'm certainly going to acknowledge it. It is almost impossible for me to imagine. I mean, there are two obvious reasons for this. The first is my current financial health, and the second is my family background. Even when there were times when my card got bounced at the supermarket checkout, I knew I could never actually go hungry. I just spent all my money on beer, so I'd have to phone up my dad and beg a sub on something or borrow off a mate. It was never. I suppose if that had gone on indefinitely, if I was a drug addict or something like that, and I really did run out of money, then even with my middle class credentials, I could perhaps have teetered upon the precipice of genuine poverty. But it would have been as a result of addiction, not as a result of government policy. And I don't know how it works anymore. I don't think it's helpful. And again, I heard a couple of Nick's callers do this, and it makes me very sad when the idea that the overall wisdom or otherwise of a unemployment benefit, of a welfare payment, should be determined upon the possibility of a tiny, tiny, tiny number of people who possibly abuse the system. And you can always find one. It was one of the first lessons I learned when I took this job. You can always find someone who'll ring in and tell you that their next door neighbour or their window cleaner's sister-in-law's cousin's first husband spend all their life on a beach in Ibiza while having it paid for by the welfare state and the hard-working taxpayers. You remember George Osborne about 10 minutes ago talking about people whose curtains are still closed in the morning. The narrative of the skiver versus the striver is one of the easiest to inflate. And of all the nasty right-wing rhetoric that we deal with on a daily basis, it's actually far from the worst, because it's a bigotry born of fear, I think. It's a bigotry born of false reassurance. The idea that the pips could never squeak for you because you've made different choices. This is probably my biggest thought of the moment, and it's a regular listeners will know, and I'm not going to explain why, but it will sound odd. It's an evolution of the reactions to the abduction of Madeleine McCann, actually, but people end up believing quite toxic and hurtful things about others because it's a way of reassuring themselves that bad things won't happen to them. And I wondered right at the outset, sorry, it's 11 minutes after 10, I hope you had a good weekend. I hope you got to kick back a bit, spend a bit of time. Well, I don't think there's much danger if you're not spending time with the family at the moment, if you live under the same roof. But you know what I mean. I hope you managed to get a few, clear your head, find a little bit of space in your head. It is, did I say a week instead of a month? I do apologise. Helen's pointed out, I just said £400 a week to live on. I'm confident that most of the people will know I made a mistake there, but it's important to make it clear immediately. It's impossible to live on north of £400 a month. Good grief, if you can't live on north of £400 a week, then it's a very different conversation that we would be having. So it's impossible to live upon just north of £400 a month. I mean, almost unbelievably impossible, This week's Full Disclosure, when are we putting it out? Do we know? We'll put it out later today, probably, is with Jack Munro, with an obvious reference to the events of last week regarding free school dinners. But I couldn't be further away from having to live on just over £400 a month. And to me, that sounds like almost 19th century levels of poverty. I mean, how many people listening to this have, over the course of the lockdown, totted up what they've spent on food deliveries, for example? I mean, by the time you've ordered for 4 people, it's perfectly possible that we've spent more on food deliveries in a month than some families have to live on. And, you could respond to that by saying, well, why don't you give away all your money then? And you sort of point out that tax is designed to dilute charity. I think it was Aneurin Bevan. It was one of the great godfathers of the Labour movement who talked about charity being a very cold and ugly thing because it shouldn't actually exist. And I know what they mean by that. I'm not on that page completely myself, and I enjoy working with charities, but not so much when it is in the realms of basic provision of the most basic needs. When someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg talks about food banks being uplifting, one can't help wondering why the hell he went into politics if he thinks that the hungriest people in the country should be fed by those possessed of rather more compassion, perhaps, and generosity than the average. And the encouragement to go the other way is is pretty huge, isn't it? That encouragement to callousness, that little impulse, hate on them. Oh, they all get pregnant so they can get a council flat. Well, one day if your child needs a council flat because they're absolutely on their uppers or they're fleeing an abusive relationship or whatever the reason may be, and it's hard to get one because people like you believed that these tabloid legends were the reality as opposed to the exception, then you end up hurting yourself potentially. I did wonder whether or not, and this might be something we get onto, or we may stay in the broader brushstrokes of this conversation. I did wonder whether the furlough and the pandemic would change our attitudes to welfare, because the idea that it could never happen to me, I'll never need it. And then suddenly, the combination of coronavirus and possibly moving forward Brexit sees us really reliant upon the welfare state. And then you discover just how thin and meagre it really is. I don't know if you fall into that category, but what I would like you to do is tell me first up this morning. It was Clement Attlee, I think, who said that stuff about charity. Thank you. Best listeners in the world. I didn't double check that, though. You better not be yanking my chain. I don't know. What does the word poor mean to you? Now, you can draw on personal experience if you want. I think that would probably be more helpful, but I don't think people like me should be excluded. If you genuinely, and then already, we've opened the door to the distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, which is hideous, isn't it? The question of, well, what would you say to the woman who had a baby in order to get a council flat? Nothing at all. Good luck, probably. But the idea that you should... the simplest way to understand these toxic tabloid tales is simply to say that's the price you pay for being safe. Do you remember the lady last week, the woman last week who talked about feeling ashamed and grateful for her food box? Ashamed that she wanted to complain about how rubbish it was because she knew she was supposed to be grateful. How much money did her parents pay in tax? How much money has she paid in tax? Who knows why people are currently in a position where they need a little bit of help from the government, from the society of which they are a part. But if you are... So already, you say if you're choosing between eating and heating, and then you'll find some nasty old geezer shouting from the sidelines about how, well, you're obviously making bad choices with regards to your food. You could all live on porridge or something. I don't think you can exclude people like that from the public discourse, but we could at least all agree to treat them with the contempt they so richly deserve, and apparently crave as well with the attention-seeking nature of some of these comments. Empathy is crucial. And another point, perhaps, people like me just don't understand until it's properly explained. And this will sound odd, may even sound a bit like a slogan, but being poor is a very expensive business. If your energy is metered, you will pay more per unit than you will if it isn't. If you don't have a store cupboard of ingredients, if you're buying a sandwich instead of a loaf of bread, do you see what I mean? It being poor can be an expensive business. But at 18 minutes after 10, apologies for the slightly extended interview. We're going to do a lot today, but I want to start with this. In the United Kingdom in 2021, how do you define poor? That's all. And we may not even need to get into the politics of it, which is really interesting. But right now, how do you define poor? And have you been poor, or are you currently poor? And if you think I need any help or guidance on handling this issue in a slightly more sensitive nature than I am, I think I've got it right so far, but crikey, nobody's perfect, then do feel free to give me a little gentle steer on that as well. So what is poor for you? What is poor? 0345 6060 973.
This is LBC. James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
22 minutes after 10 is the time. I told you there'd be a lot going on today. It would appear that a convoy of Scottish fishing lorries have arrived in Westminster, where I know it has been threatened that they were planning to dump the catches, the stocks that are currently unsellable as a result of Brexit. Some claims that it was short-term teething problems, other claims that it is a direct consequence of the government's failure to understand the detail of the deal that they announced on Christmas Eve. The pictures are live and they are accurate, and there are, as far as I can tell, I think you're looking at a dozen or so trucks at the moment making their way towards Parliament. What their plan is, we will endeavour to find out. Maybe more than a dozen, actually. There's loads, and it addresses something else. Sorry, I'm just waiting for one of the lads involved to appear on my screen, so that's why I'm not moving on to the phone-in element of the programme just yet. But I did say to the producer this morning, where's all the Brexit stories in the newspapers? Social media is full of it at the moment, the problems people are having with business. There was a wine merchant describing his best efforts to actually understand the new reality and the conclusion it could well kill off his business. The fishing stuff, which Dominic Raab spectacularly dismissed yesterday on the telly as having nothing to do with Brexit, or he doesn't believe that it has anything to do with Brexit. So I found myself wondering this morning, where's all the courage and how do we do it? Because we, of course, labour under the great danger of looking like I told you so, or looking like kind of retrospective pats on the back for each other. But if we don't talk about it, who the hell will? Who will? 24 minutes after 10 is the time. Mark Moore is from the Dartmouth Crab Company, which automatically compels me to correct the claim that it was Scottish fishermen exclusively who were part of, or maybe it is. Let's find out. Mark Moore is on the line. Mark, thank you for your time. What's going on?
Good morning. Well,
Hello.
It is industry and nationwide. It's certainly not exclusively the Scots. We're all in this together. You know, we're all very competitive within our industry, but on the other hand, you know, the situation is almost unworkable, and we need some change. You know, our industry is spiraling downwards.
So, what exactly? Before we dig into that detail, what exactly are you and your compadres up to right now?
Well, we're driving around London. I think there's upwards of 50 fish lorries, shellfish transport lorries, cruising around London, enjoying a day out and everything else, and just trying to raise awareness. It's not supposed to be an aggressive, protest. We're just trying to raise awareness that, you know, yes, the bulk of the fishing industry voted for Brexit. We're not denying that, but it's the terms we have to work under now that is so difficult, you know. So
you're not going to be dumping rotting crab carcasses at the door of Downing Street or anything like that. You're just presumably, implicitly or explicitly responding to the Foreign Secretary's suggestion yesterday that he doesn't believe the problems you're currently having have anything to do with Brexit.
Of course they have something to do with Brexit because of the increased documentation we have to produce now. We're not per se complaining about that. We knew that would happen. That was always going to happen. But it's the way in which we have to collate it, the time frames we have to produce it. Our industry is very, very much just in time, you know, more so than any other job. And
for obvious reasons, we're almost all of us have encountered what happens if fish is not dealt with just in time, haven't we?
Absolutely. You know, but ours is a live product. You're trying to get it as, you know, we send a weekly lorry to Portugal, weekly lorries to Spain and France. Other guys are doing exactly the same job as us. And, you know, delays at the ports in France are making things difficult. You know, one guy had a consignment stop because of 0.7% error, 7.7 kilo error in documentation, which is ridiculous, you know.
Well, except from their point of view, that them's the rules, and they always have been, and we thought we'd be better off out.
I'm just to say, I'm not saying that, you know. I mean, we always, the fishing industry was the driver behind Brexit, I would say.
Elements of it were. I think you were horribly hijacked by people like Nigel Farage. But here's the problem.
You're there.
And I don't necessarily want to personalise it, Mike, but
no.
The thing that baffles a lot of us who've been watching it very closely for a long time and saw the writing on the wall for the situation you currently find yourself in is all the talk of being able to catch more. Why did none of you stop and think about who you were going to sell it to?
Well, we always did.
Right.
We always did. I think, you're moving away a little bit from my theatre of operation.
Okay.
I'm
But
very,
I mean, the fishing industry's
I'm very much a
problem.
selfish man.
The fishing industry was persuaded to back this ludicrous project because you'd be able to catch more fish, and no one, as far as I can tell, ever stopped to query who you were going to be able to sell it to if we were out of the single market and the customs union.
We always knew that our main outlet is Europe, and that should continue. I mean, you have to remember it's a protein source for the Europeans in the same way as chicken or whatever in this country, and they need that protein source. Their threats that they won't buy our fish was only a short-term thing, rhetoric.
It's not a threat that they won't. It's red tape that means they can't.
Well, that's it. Yes, it's the red tape is the problem.
But you voted for more.
Sorry, well, now you're saying you. I never voted.
I beg your pardon. The fishing industry, as you said yourself at the outset, is widely perceived as having backed this very passionately. I've got pictures being sent to me now of Farage throwing fish into the Thames. Everyone's cheering him along. I have enormous sympathy for your situation, but I'm keen to address the people who don't. I want them to understand the urgency of your plight and why they should be on your side, Mike.
What it is, at the end of the day, it's about documentation. It's about bureaucracy. Is what's slowing the system up. They still want our product.
Yes.
They still want our product. They're up in arms as well. But you have to remember, we have a lot of foreign. Certainly, one of my closest customers in France, he sends 2 lorries per week to UK. Bulk of the Spanish industry send their lorries, which we unload to.
I know.
They are up in arms, scared to death.
They're just not going to come. I'm going to run out of time. What does success look like, Mark Moore, this morning? But what does, for you and your colleagues, your compadres trucking around London at the moment, what does success look like? What do you want to hear from the government?
We want to hear some little changes. We accept the documentation is here to stay. We need some streamlining, and we need some understanding that our little business, our little industry needs some sort of special treatment, otherwise it is going to stop.
I feel for you. I really do. Keep in touch. Let me know if there's anything else I can do. You ever need a platform, you ever need a megaphone, then I'll be happy to help, because, of course, these are people who were persuaded to vote for something that many of us spent years explaining would probably make their lives worse. Luckily, Dominic Raab, Mark Moore from the Dartmouth Crab Company, thank you. Dominic Raab's got your back, mate. Don't you worry.
I'm not convinced that that's a result of the agreement. The agreement will... sorry, Andrew, can I answer the question? The agreement we have struck, both short-term and medium-term and long-term, will create huge sustainable opportunities. Of course, we've always said as we leave the transition period, and with a deal, but even more if we hadn't have had a deal, there will be some teething problems. We're very focused on working with all of the different sectors, including the fishing industry, to resolve any of these teething problems.
Oh, yes. OK, well, that's all right then. Dominic's got it all under control. 10:30 is the time. Holly Harris is here now with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
10:35 is the time. Keeping an eye on the fishing protests in Westminster. Some of you are kind enough to compliment me upon the quality of my predictions regarding Brexit. If you told me that the fishing industry would be up in arms 3 weeks after Boris Johnson's deal was unveiled, I would genuinely have laughed in your face. Quite what the calculation here is, God only knows. The suggestion from many of us that fishing was being given undue prominence in the negotiations was, I think, true. The comparisons of what its impact is on the economy compared to, say, Harrods. But... I mean, the evidence of the fraudulence of almost all of the entire project couldn't be clearer. Why are we doing it? Because we need fish. Control our waters. All right, how are the fishermen feeling about this? 3 weeks after it was unveiled, they've driven their trucks to London to complain about what's happened. Now, some of this will be fixed. Of course it will. But it will be harder than it was before. And it will be more costly than it was before. And Brexit was supposed to make things better. 10:36 is the time. Speaking about things being costly and hard, what does the word poor, what is poverty in the UK in 2021? And where is it? What does it look like? What does it feel like. Tara is in Morden to kick things off somewhat belatedly. Tara, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
I'm sorry, I'm really nervous.
It's only me. It's only me.
I had to call because I've been listening to these conversations for a long time, and Nick's programme before really got to me, and I decided to call you instead.
Okay.
But I grew up poor in the sort of the sense that nobody could argue with workless household benefits, etc., etc. It feels like you've got no opportunity. It feels like you've got no choices. It feels like you're embarrassed all the time.
Can I? When did you realise you were poor as a little girl?
Oh God, when I was quite young, but I remember being 10 when I really realised it. And I went to one of my aunt's houses. Well, she just moved, and I went to a new house, and it was just beautiful, and it was just unlike anything that had sort of felt like it was in reach. I didn't even realise it existed, if that makes sense. It was just...
Of course it does.
And I sort of remember that sort of... It felt sort of like a bit of a stab, I suppose. And I can still, I'm 42 and I can still remember that really clearly. But, I was really lucky. My mum was amazing. She was really... she was very intelligent. She really encouraged me. I was lucky I was quite bright, so I did really well at school and all of those things. So she wanted me to have opportunity. But it's things like when you're in that horrible, dysfunctional, chaotic relationship, you can't just leave because how do you afford anything?
Choices, the word, one of the first words you said, I think, is because they say money can't buy you happiness, but whether that's true or not is one for the ages. I'll take my chances, I think, but choices is the most obvious thing that money buys you. Choices and freedoms.
And she just drilled into me. It felt a bit like a sort of a mantra, but it was don't rely on people, do the best you can,
yes, of course.
Work hard, etc., etc., etc. And so now I'm really lucky, because I'm not at all poor, and it quite frequently astonishes me that I'm not. And I just did it. I mean, really stupid stuff. I got my car serviced 2 days ago, and the garage guy called me and he said, "Oh, that's £235." I said, "Really? I thought it'd be more than that because of blah." And he said, "I said, okay, fine. I just paid it." And I just paid it.
Promise me you'll never do that again, Tara, you silly sausage. Because next time, I'm sure he's a stand-up guy. with a magnificent conscience, but if he isn't, then next time you turn up, you might find that things are. I thought you were going to say, turn around and say, "Oh, all right, madam, how does £400 sound?"
No, I do know him, so I knew he wouldn't do that.
Of course.
But it was completely alien, and so when I wanted to go on the school trip, you don't go home and tell your mum that there's a skiing trip. You don't tell them.
No.
Or you don't,
because you already know the answer. If I was, and I know it can be a fairly weird experience ringing up a radio show, but if I was a tabloid journalist, I, for example, would now jump on what you just said and say, oh, she couldn't go on a skiing trip and she thinks she's poor, and you understand these dangers and these toxic temptations of the tabloid culture more than I do. So I mean, what might, for example, shock someone living in a middle-class bubble like mine, or perhaps like the one you live in now, to know that it's happening on our watch, so to speak, in our lifetime?
I used to sometimes go to the corner shop for my mum, obviously. I had 2 sisters. They were quite a lot younger than me. And I'd go to the shop, and I distinctly remember being 14.
Yes.
And going to the shop and having to ask for credit.
Yeah.
Sorry, that really still gets me.
I can tell it does. That's a real echo there, isn't it?
And the guy
and there's shame attached to that, because if I'd forgotten my wallet in Budgeons, then it'd be fine for me to, "Oh, look, can I pay you later?" But for you, it's a millstone of shame.
My card got declined the other day, but I knew I had the money in there.
Do you still get the wobble, though? Do you still get the wobble? Because, if there's a queue behind you and stuff like that, and it's a mistake, that you've got money in the bank, but that's a weird stigma that we all paint on each other. And I don't get it because, they're but for the grace of God. And go on.
I just don't get why. I don't get why it has to be a race to the bottom.
Nor do I.
I don't get why I don't get why you have to be so concerned about whether somebody is doing.
No, I do actually.
I just find
kiss up, spit down. Well, imagine if we actually started focusing upon the real reasons for inequality in our society. Imagine if, Jacob Rees-Mogg calls food banks uplifting, and then goes on to call the people that died in Grenfell Tower lacking in common sense. And then goes on. So if we actually focused upon the real reasons for epic, entrenched and inherited inequality, it's highly unlikely we'd be picking on people like your mum, Tara.
It's just my husband's amazing. He's lovely.
Yes.
We've been together a long time. He's from staunchly middle class background.
Yes.
He lives in came from a nice big house. And I remember when I met him, I was thinking, how's this going to work when I get taken back to meet his parents? His parents are amazing, and they are. But you find out more and you realise their background's different. But it's things like when middle class people talk about being quite, it was tough for us earlier on, and we didn't have much money. It's different because they didn't have much money because they were doing up their house and they were saving, and they could only go to France. I went on 3 holidays when I was younger. In my entire childhood, 3 holidays. I went to Bournemouth and Eastbourne for long weekends.
And that's more than many.
And that was fine. And I had a really nice time. I don't feel like, but I'm just. It was alien. The idea that I'd go to Spain or something was
just a million miles away. Just before you go, someone's texted in to say that maybe they didn't hear you properly. Are you suggesting that you shouldn't rely on anyone else and you should look out for yourself? That's what. No. I know you're not, but obviously I have a lot of idiots texting me, so I just thought I'd let you deal with that one.
No, I don't think that at all.
No, I know you don't, but he's got gammon in his ears.
I think it's our responsibility to help whoever we can if we can. I'm not phoning on to say about all the things that I do and don't do and help for X, Y, and Z because
Why do you think they had to invent the phrase virtue signalling? Because they had to try and denigrate people like you that do their best to help others. So they have to invent these phrases in order to actually keep the ship afloat, the ship of blame. Kiss up, spit down. Tara, that was a sparkling debut. I look forward to your second appearance on the programme. Some detail, specific detail, also some of the broader brushstrokes. What does it mean to be poor in the UK in 2021? And listen, I'm just doing my best, lads. Give us a break. Nobody's perfect. But obviously, many of us perhaps need more knowledge, understanding of working and still being poor. Because that, I think, is why Marcus Rashford's advocacy has partly been so powerful. The image of his mum doing 2-3 jobs and still not being able to feed her children or still skipping meals so that they could eat. That breaks just about every imaginable clause of any imaginable social contract. But of course, if you're going to call food banks uplifting, then you're going to get away with it, aren't you? Until we wake up and realise that it's highly unlikely the things in our own lives we're unhappy about are the fault of the people who've got even less than we have. But hey-ho, we've had about 150 years of British politics trying to crack that particular nut, and it's fair to say that at the current point in our shared history, it's not exactly going well.
Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, with James O'Brien.
10:49 is the time. Just indulge me for a minute, Elizabeth. I'll be with you imminently. This is not about parsimony or tightness. Okay, this isn't about the people with very deep pockets or people who never buy around. This is a genuine question about what you would consider to be an unforgivable loss or an amount of money you couldn't contemplate ignoring. And it's a fairly grim picture that I'm going to paint, and it may only work for men because most women presumably are unfamiliar with just how manky the average gent's toilet can be. But if you were to drop a coin or a note upon the floor, and it works even better now with notes, given that they're now mostly plasticated, aren't they? If you were to drop a coin or a note onto the floor of a gent's toilet, and it was covered in all the stuff you'd expect, how big a denomination would it have to be before you got down on, and it had sort of slipped under the cistern or slipped behind the urinal. You have to get down on your hands and knees and rescue it. So I'm presuming a penny wouldn't tempt anybody. Similarly, tuppence, 5p, 10p, 20p, 50p. Well, if 20 quid a week is making a huge difference to your lifestyle, then 50p, a quid, a 2 quid coin, a £5 note, a £10 note, a £20, I don't know. It's just one of those little devices I sometimes come up with in the hope of making what can be very big issues feel all the more immediate. And we're keeping an eye on that seafood story. We'll probably turn our attention to the topic after, well, at some point today. But now I've got a switchboard full of people waiting to talk about this. So why don't you shut up, James, and actually listen to some of them? Thank you very much, Keith. Great point. Elizabeth's in Islington. Elizabeth, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
First time call, a bit nervous.
Don't be, it's only me. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I've always thought that, for me, I'm just speaking from my perspective, poverty is cultural. When I was a little girl, my dad was a builder. He was a migrant from Ireland. There was no work in Ireland in the 40s. So he came over here with my mother, and we were poor.
How did you know you were,
day.
sorry to turn your life into a, but how did you know you were poor?
I went to school with English working class, white English working class. It was predominantly them in the school, and they had phones, they had cars.
In the house, they had a house phone.
Yeah, they had a landline. This was in the early 70s.
Yes.
And they had a bath with running water. We didn't have that. We lived in lodgings from a Turkish family. We were really poor. My dad worked every day. There was food on the table. But as I got older, there was enough money to go back home to Ireland once a year for 6 weeks. But, I mean, I got teased about, poverty and not having the right clothes. And I didn't have free school meals, but I was very aware that we didn't have what the others had.
And I get that, and I choose my words carefully. I find it easier to get my head around what was normal in the 60s and the 70s than I do what is normal now. Do you? What would you say poor meant in the UK in 2021? Probably similar things, but we've all got...
No, I think, to be honest, it's still the same for me, cultural poverty. When I was a little girl, my dad took me to all the art galleries in London, the National Gallery over and over, Cutty Sark over and over.
Yes.
Anything that we could get into, the National Portrait Gallery, Horniman Museum, anywhere. He would just take me anywhere. He took me to pantomimes. He would save up and take me once a year.
To get your brain, to get your mind, the doors of perception open, to broaden your horizons, to give you an idea of how big the world could be.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I don't want to start crying, but yes, you've hit the nail on the head. He wanted me to see what I could do and what London had to offer. I mean, the same things are available in Ireland, but I wasn't brought up there in the way that I was brought up here.
It's a strange one, that, because in a way you're reminding us of some things that you don't need money to. There's an unfairness here as well, because your dad worked, and if he was working on building sites, he worked blooming hard, and yet,
he did.
Yet success involved just keeping your head above water.
Not even that, really. I mean, like I said, I never had to have free school meals. I consider myself fairly well educated, and I'm not poor now, thank God. But I have had times when I've been really poor, but always what's kept me going. When my mother died, I left my job to look after her, and 4 years later she was gone. And I wasn't really in a fit state to go back to a 9-to-5 job. So I claimed benefits for the first time, and that was awful. I hated doing that, and I was really poor. But what kept me going, I wanted to write poetry. So I did evening classes, and I stuck to it.
Yes.
And now I've
that's
got
that your dad has, you've reaped what your dad sowed back in the day, and that attention to your imagination has been repaid several-fold, clearly. Elizabeth, thank you. 10:55. Paul's in Tunbridge. Paul, what does poor mean to you?
Poor in 2021 means that you're treated generically by the government and not independently.
Explain that to me.
Well, I had a broken arm for 3 to 4 years. Well, it's still broke now. So, for 3 years. I've worked all my life. Always have. Always put in the pot. And, unfortunately, I broke my arm and then I had to get into the universal credit system, which was terrible.
What happened?
They don't pay you. Well, they don't pay you any money for the first 5 weeks or your rent.
Yes.
So the minute you start getting your benefits.
Your tech business is in a race to stay ahead of the competition. And you might be wondering if China could be your next move. But to work out whether China is the right opportunity, there are lots of things you'll need to know, from customs compliance to cybersecurity. To explore important questions like how to protect your intellectual property, how Chinese law might affect your business, and how to check the background of potential business partners, visit gov.uk/digital and tech China. See the potential, know the challenge.
You're paying back the debts that have acquired.
You're already two
monthly
steps forward,
debt.
one step back.
Yeah. So I was living on £60 a week for.
What would have to
3
come out
years.
of that? What would have to come out of the 60 quid?
Well, if you want a phone, I know that's a luxury. But
Yeah, it's not though, is it? What are you supposed to do in the 21st century without a phone?
I know. Yeah, water bills, electric, gas,
Food.
You have to pay criminal compensation.
What's
I was
that?
going to. Sorry, not criminal compensation. You have to pay towards your council tax. Sorry,
Right.
You still have to pay some.
Well, even
They
if you
don't pay
were
it all.
paying criminal compensation, it's still coming out of the same pot, isn't it? And
Yeah.
so
No, sorry, I got criminal compensation. I've just got mixed up.
you've got criminal
yeah,
compensation, and you
Yeah,
had to
so-
pay your council. Okay, I'm glad we've cleared that up. As I said before, it can be a weird experience ringing a radio show, especially when it's also personal. So you were unable to work because of an injury.
Yeah.
Universal Credit expected you to make ends meet on 60 quid a week, but also covered your rent. Is that right?
No, they covered my rent, and then out of the £60 a week, I've got to buy food and pay bills. The only luxury I really have is mobile phone.
And it breaks my heart that you
live at
think
home.
of that as a luxury, but I do understand why you do. It'd be flat screen it's the new flat screen television,
no, I
is
haven't got
it?
all that. There's none of that.
I know,
my
mate.
furniture's second hand.
Yeah. I hate the idea that I'm indulging in what some people call poverty porn, but you mentioned that you paid in all your life. You were not expecting this.
No.
You were not expecting the safety net to feel like this. What can I ask,
No,
without
and I feel
upsetting you,
sorry for anyone
what have been the lowest moments, the lowest experiences, the stuff that's really brought home just how unfair your situation is?
Going to food banks isn't nice.
No.
I've been out shoplifting as well, which doesn't make me proud.
No.
I've done things that I didn't want to do just to survive. And any family in this country at the moment that has to go on universal credit, I feel for them if they have to go through that same thing that I did.
And
Because
have you benefited from this extra 20 quid a week? Or is that just for families? You have benefited from it?
It's a long story. Back in March, I got back payment because I've been injured.
Yes.
But it's hard to say because universal credit's under the same umbrella, but I should be getting sickness allowance, not job seekers allowance, because I wasn't looking for a job. Job seekers is £70 a week. ESA, sick pay, it's about £100 a week more. You can live on that.
Right.
But it's trying to get the sick pay. Then
getting through the
going
system.
for,
And even our
assessments and then
statutory sick
saying-
pay, when you compare it to other European countries, is spectacularly low. So, and then presumably you run out of puff, and the whole system. Ian Duncan Smith, of course. To be fair to the fellow, universal credit might be a nightmare, but at least he's been proved right about Brexit. Ian Duncan Smith's motivation seemed to be to just make it all so difficult that people.
It's all right once you're on it.
Right.
Once you're on it, it's not too bad. But it's the beginning bit of not getting paid anything and then not paying your rent. So then when you actually do get money, then you're in debt straight away. That's why I was getting £60 a week because I was paying off.
Can you apply for universal credit without a smartphone or without internet access?
No, I don't think so. Not while the pandemic's on. You have to go to the job centre.
It's a funny old mate. Look after yourself, won't you? There's
you,
one,
James.
just so you know, Paul. That one texter is here calling you a liar. Says he should have been on disability if his arm was broken for 3 years. So
Well, that's what the battle I was having.
I understand.
You
I
try and
understand
get
that.
You try and get it.
I understand that.
I've got doctors and surgeons
I
saying
know.
I'm sick, and I've got an assessor saying I'm not.
Yes,
Can
but-
you stand up? Can you sit down? Can you turn the light on? You're fit to work.
Yes, I know. But of course, this is the what you might call the poverty of intelligence. That people would
Yeah.
prefer to believe that you're a
It's
liar.
all right until you have to go through it. It's all right
What
for
were you like
everybody.
then? What were you like before you fell in. Could you imagine yourself ever sending me a text like that 10 years ago?
No, I'm a fair person.
I'm a decent human being.
This country is disgraceful.
It is, I know, but it's also too much at the same time. And you wonder quite what the tabloid culture has done to our country. You need look no further than that. Who are you very cross with? A bloke on the radio who hasn't been able to work for 3 years and can't get the benefits, the social security payments that he's entitled to. What you're cross with him? Yes, he's a liar. Look what they've done to you, mate. Just tuck that forelock, doff that cap, and your children will be next. It's 11 o'clock.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
4 minutes after 11. All right, who thought an hour had gone already of this? I've only just sat down. Seriously, I've barely had a sip of my tea. But here we are, contemplating the vote later today in which Boris Johnson will instruct his MPs not to support calls for extending the £20 a week that the poorest families in the country currently get. And remember, universal credit is not an unemployment benefit. It can be paid and is paid to people who are in work. The Business Minister, Nadhim Zahawi, has said that the Chancellor will set out the additional help he will provide families in early March before the current payment expires. So there's a little bit of politicking going on. And here's an interest. I could have got this wrong. It's not an area to which I've paid an enormous amount of attention yet. But this so-called Northern Research Group, a lot of MPs newly arrived in Parliament, having breached that red wall in the last election, largely because so many people felt so completely alienated by the last leader of the Labour Party and his ludicrous acolytes. Don't at me on that. That's what they say. So you got a problem with it. Go and hang out in the former mining communities of the North and find out what they think about the last leader of the Labour Party. And this door that he sort of allowed to open without realising has and these MPs, some of them, I don't know where they sit on culture wars and prioritising statues over humans and stuff like that, probably in the cheap seats, but they seem to be, and I'm saying this very cautiously with the full cognizance that I could be horribly, horribly wrong, and if I am, I shall cough for it. They seem to understand the plight of the working poor, or the non-working poor, the workless poor. Just at the early doors, there seems to be. Well, look, in a nutshell, that's Johnson's nightmare. Is that he's worried there's 60 odd MPs in that grouping who seem to understand what it would be like to try to live on what our last caller was telling us about, or at least have some idea of it. Now, they can go in one of two ways. They can go down that road there, which says, sod 'em all, they'll spend it all on crack dens and brothels. So we're not talking about that breed of Conservative backbencher. Or they can say, look, poverty is now reaching into homes that have played by all of the rules. You and I know it always has. Anyway, just putting a thought out there. Callum's in Manchester. Callum, the definition almost of poor in 2021 UK, where would you go first? What would you reach for?
Hiya, James. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Welcome.
Quite nervous, to be fair.
Well, that's me.
I think the definition of it is sort of the idea that so many Britons have to live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I mean, I sort of called just to tell a little story about an experience I had last year.
Yeah, go on.
So, unfortunately, I lost my job around June last year. Thankfully, I'm back in employment now and have been for a few months.
Right.
But obviously, I had to rely on universal credit, and I had my own little flat to pay me rent and bills and things, and I obviously couldn't afford it. And so, relying on universal credit, I applied for that, and I didn't get any payment for 6 or 7 weeks. And the payment I did get was actually £670 a month.
Right.
Which never even covered. It didn't even cover my rent for my flat. Thankfully, I had a parent who could help me out. But there's many people who are in that position. And when I spoke to the team at Universal Credit, they told me the reason why I wasn't entitled to more money was because I'm only 24, and that I didn't get my full rent or most of my rent covered. It was only a small portion of it, so I had to look elsewhere for help. So when
this might be an odd question to ask, and it's not your job to answer it, but what do you think they, I suppose I mean the architects of Universal Credit, or indeed the demonisers of the working or the workless poor, what do they think would happen to someone like you in that situation? Is it naivety? Do they presume everyone can ring mum or dad or everyone can muddle through, and that 5 to 6 week gap just doesn't compute because they can't actually... I'm going to say this, and I think I'm going to stick with it. They actually have an intellectual or a philosophical or an emotional inability to conceive of zero. They cannot imagine nothing, which is what you had coming in potentially for a month and a half.
Yeah, well, it was a weird one, to be honest, when I spoke to them, because, I was they were sort of the monkeys that had to listen to me complain, and I was very aware it wasn't those people on the phones who were the...
I'm glad you were, but you can understand why some people do take out their frustrations on the foot soldiers rather than the general.
I must admit I was one of them, but I was sort of shouting at them, but apologising for shouting at them. I was sort of wishing I could speak to the Working Pension Secretary instead of...
Yeah, good luck with that, mate. I've got a national radio show and I can't get close to them, so we never know. Don't take it personally.
I do listen and always wonder why none of them turn up on your show. It baffles me, really.
The door's always
open. I can't imagine a reason why.
No, me neither. So I mean, you that idea of nothing is almost impossible to contemplate if you've never actually experienced it.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm only young, and it was the first time I'd ever had to deal with any form of benefits, and I knew, there's always that stereotype of they all have Sky TV and iPhones and things, but even the small thing about, I couldn't even go to the pub to see my friends and things like that. It was, it really has an effect on so many people. And I was quite shocked when I realised I'd only get the amount of money that I did, that in a country as rich as ours and an economy as recognised as ours, that we just leave people to just fend for themselves. And so, not everyone has a parent who can help them out. And, I was thankfully in that position, but I know for a fact there's so many people in this country who don't have any extra help.
Of course. Or their parents are skint as well. I mean, it's
Well, or that as well. I mean, it was unfortunate, obviously, that I lost my job, and it was the main reason due to the pandemic. But, I'd never think I'd find myself in such a position, and it really has a horrible effect on me. I never considered myself to have bad mental health issues,
right.
But I really got in my head. I thought I was applying for so much and getting nowhere, and poverty isn't just not
chips
having
away
money.
Doesn't it?
It can be so much more than that. Poverty can go from being poor to really affecting your head and not being able to just do the smallest thing, to go into the pub, having a pint with your friends, and it's horrible.
It's funny how I'm not saying all, but many of the people who historically would have dismissed you or poo-pooed you or indulged in those stereotypes about flat-screen televisions and suddenly, while expressing opposition to the lockdowns, they've discovered, I gather, they've discovered a deep and abiding concern for society's most vulnerable people in the context of both poverty and mental health. So, maybe that's a silver lining from the coronavirus cloud, Callum, or maybe they're just lying.
Yeah, I think the thing that baffled me the most when I spoke to them on the phone, it was because you get like a breakdown of what you will get in the end, and I was quite surprised. So I called them and said I must be entitled to more, and the reason they gave me was because I was 24. When no one relied on me and all that business, that I wasn't allowed more. And I just thought, well, just because I'm young doesn't mean everything's half price. It made no sense to me.
No, I can see the logic in you not having dependents, but that's got nothing to do with your age.
I don't get a half price discount on rent because I'm 24. I don't get a half price discount on a loaf of bread and things like that. So
it's not permanent happy hour.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I wish it was, but I couldn't understand the logic to it, and I just.
Well, I don't think there is any logic, is there?
It's thinking I was entitled to more under the current government, but I just can't understand how they let people
Well, because you would not have survived if you hadn't had other sources, financial sources to call on. But you're back on your feet now.
Well, yeah, I'm back in work now. I was only employed for 4 months. Thankfully, I went back to the place I was originally at.
Right.
And luckily, I'm working from home today because I'm really busy. But, thankfully, I'm back on my feet and still sort of...
And that's what you make... Yeah, I love the way your mind works. You worry about people who may not. As you talk about the mental health, people who possibly slip through the cracks, and they're not really cracks, are they? They're whopping great crevices. If these are cracks, then so is the Grand Canyon. Callum, thank you. I'm staying with this for a little longer because it is so important and so interesting. Although the as ever with conversations like this, quite what the light at the end of the tunnel might look like, I do not know. Your best chance, many would argue, is currently Sir Keir Starmer, but the gap, I suppose, simply in terms of chronology. And a lot of you are suggesting that here's a good example. Grace says, look into the background of these newly elected Red Wall MPs. They were picked because they were majority working class. I think, Grace, it's also fair to say they were picked because of their slavish loyalty to the Brexit project, but we can't litigate everything on that mistake. Have a quick mooch and you'd be shocked, James. Also look into the blue-collar Tory group. These aren't conventional Tories. It's not a bad thing. If there are decent people in these two categories, then they presumably are furious that some of the most prominent members of this cabal are the ones talking about crack dens and brothels in the context of hungry school children. I don't know why that one got me so. Given that I've spent the last 15 years chronicling the worst excesses of performative callousness from Conservative politicians. But that one just seemed to me to almost demand a new category of its own. It's 11:15. I'm sure he'll be on your telly later, wanging on about why the poor have only got themselves to blame.
This is LBC, leading Britain's conversation. LBC with James O'Brien.
90 minutes after 11 is the time. Focus on fish at the moment with regard to Brexit. But I'm just looking, someone's just sent me an article from Autocar magazine which suggests that sector may be next in the spotlight. But I'd like to turn your attention first to the continuing experiences of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who returned to Russia yesterday, having been treated in Germany for a poisoning that was ordered by the Kremlin. And I just briefly, before we talk to somebody who really knows what's what, I just want to tell you something that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said a few moments ago. He said, the West is raising questions about Navalny in order to distract public attention from the existential crisis they live in. Now, one of the questions that you often asked me 3 or 4 years ago when we started talking about Russian disruption or cyber warfare or whatever you wanted to call it, and the everything from encouraging people in the West to reject vaccines, to encouraging people in the West to vote for Donald Trump, right through to encouraging people in the West to vote for Brexit. You say, why would the Russians want to do such damage to the West? And there's your answer, coupled with the experiences in Ukraine a few years ago. If your survival and your money that you've stolen from your own people depends upon keeping your own people in the dark, and your own people are beginning to display a little bit of envy of what we could describe as Western liberal democratic values, then your best chance, Bill Browder explained this to us years ago, long before we even knew Alexei Navalny's name or Boris Nemtsov's name. The only chance you've got of hanging on to all the money you've stolen off your own people is persuading them that that great new dawn on the horizon represented by Western liberal democracy is actually worse than what they've already got, or simply you can tarnish it. And that's why one imagines that Vladimir Putin was cracking open bottles of vintage champagne when Donald Trump's supporters launched an attack upon the cradle of American liberal democracy. And there it is. I mean, Lavrov saying it out loud. The West is raising questions about Navalny in order to distract public attention from the existential crisis they live in. The more chaos, carnage and corruption we concede and or see in the West, then the less accountable we become, by definition. And few people encompass or encapsulate this more than Alexei Navalny, who is now, well, I shall invite Christo Grozev, who works for the magnificent Bellingcat organisation, to tell us a little bit more. He's in what I think could only accurately be described, Christo, as he's currently appearing in a kangaroo court. Christo, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
That's great. So can we describe what's happening to him now loosely as a kangaroo court?
Absolutely. That's what I used in my description on Twitter. It is something that I haven't seen before. It's something that was put together ad hoc just to create the impression of some legitimacy. But it is furthermore a kangaroo court that is visible to the rest of the world because Alexei is able to sneak out video of himself addressing and essentially making fun of these ad hocers. And
I mean, this is what perhaps we need your help in understanding on this side of the story, because I mean, for all his myriad faults, Putin is usually quite good at dealing with, or quite, from his own judgment, he's effective when dealing with dissidents, whether he is killing them or poisoning them or simply silencing them. Navalny is winning, I think. Is it fair to say that? Navalny is doing things that make Putin look incompetent.
I'm not sure if we can say Navalny's winning, but we can say definitely is that Putin is losing.
Yes,
because he has no winning strategy. It's in chess. It's called Zugzwang. Anything that Putin does now is bound to be a losing move. And he had two basic choices: to not arrest Navalny upon arrival, or to arrest him. The one winning choice for him that he was hoping he would achieve was Navalny not coming back to Russia.
Right.
That's why he came up with all of these sequential threats of new litigation, of new charges that were being piled up on Navalny while he was in Germany, including the ridiculous one under which he is now held, which is that he didn't report for his parole hearing or for his regular meetings with law enforcement while he was in a coma. But Navalny challenged all of that. He took the bluff. He called Putin's bluff, and he showed up. And this is why anything Putin does now is going to put him deeper in trouble.
One of the problems we have here is getting an idea of what sort of support or indeed status Alexei Navalny enjoys in Russia. Can you help us with that?
I don't think anybody knows that. I don't think Navalny knows that because it's a matter of changes as we breathe every minute. I think his support is growing. First of all, we'll never be able to figure out the support based on official data because polling is just not a thing in Russia. I mean, everybody's afraid of answering even the question. But more importantly, a lot of Russians kind of discounted Navalny as an inefficient fighter against Putin, just because he was just doing his investigations on YouTube. Looked like a lot of fun, but Putin seemed to not pay attention to him. Now that has changed. Now Putin has essentially, this is the typical Barbra Streisand effect, where Putin is trying to ignore somebody, but brings him into the focus more and more. And what Navalny has shown is he's able to make Putin worry. He's able to make Putin change flight plans of an airplane yesterday. And this is giving a lot of hope to people who previously discounted Navalny. So I think what we are about to see is in the next few weeks an increase in people who are actually enthused by what Navalny is doing.
I mentioned in my introduction, I don't know if you heard, I mentioned Boris Nemtsov, and of course he was killed by Putin's forces. Alexei Navalny clearly takes his life in his hands with this return to Russia.
Yeah, that's true, and that's not something that is easy for any of us to sort of conceptualize why he's doing that. But then again, none of us has actually gone through a near-death experience at the hands of now what he knows is Putin. And there's no way we can put ourselves in his position. What I know is that he did not leave Russia voluntarily. He just woke up in a different country and realized he had been poisoned. So it's natural for him to want to continue the fight from where he left it, in Russia.
Do you indulge in speculation ever about what might happen next?
Well, so far the sort of estimates we've made have come true. I mean, we guessed he was going to be arrested. I don't think Putin is going to risk another attempt on his life. Now that it's known to most of society in Russia who did it, there's no plausible, deniable way for him to do it another time. So I think what Putin is going to try to do in the next few days is see how much public support Navalny will gather in the streets. And depending on that, he will either release him or keep him in jail. But most important thing is Putin, for the first time, has no idea what to do. And that's already an achievement.
Indeed it is. Just before you go, I again mentioned just before you came on, I saw on your Twitter feed the comments from the foreign minister about how, I mean, essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, what he's really doing is taking the chaos and the disruption in the West, Sergei Navalny, and saying, well, you lot, because people like Dominic Raab have expressed their concern about Navalny. A lot of European leaders, Guy Verhofstadt yesterday was very vocal. But what Lavrov is doing, forgive me, Lavrov is turning around essentially and saying, well, you lot can't tell us what to do because your own countries are in such a mess now. Is that a fair description of the tactic?
That is a fair description. The West has given the perfect present to Russia over the last year by not really knowing what it's doing on many different levels. So yes, that will be used and abused by Russian propaganda. But in any case, the fact that Lavrov could not really respond to subsequent questions from journalists about why Russia has not come up with any sort of coherent answer as to the accusations about who poisoned Navalny, they just stopped short of even answering. So that means that these answers, these prevarications will not be sufficient. They have to come up with some answers sooner or later.
And as you've pointed out, however bad situations may be in Donald Trump's America or in Britain, Russia is a country that poisons its own citizens. That's just a given now.
Yes, I mean, it was ridiculous that Lavrov used the term existential crisis in the West, when it's literally an existential crisis for people in Russia.
Christo Grozev, great work. Thank you, as always. If you follow Christo on Twitter, you can see his live coverage, really, of the unfolding events, a 50-minute recess at the moment in that kangaroo court case, and you can find out more about Christo's work at Bellingcat and a variety of other outlets. But in the first instance, I'd just advise you to follow him on Twitter, as it sounds, Christo Grozev, Grozev. 29 minutes after 11 is the time. I've told you a few times when I do the Magnitsky, I work just very, very, very distant, no real dangers on that front. But you meet people. I do the Magnitsky Awards, which recognises originally the people in the world most committed to opposing Vladimir Putin, and now under the leadership of my friend Bill Browder, the people continuing similar crusades elsewhere on the planet. But you do actually meet these people. I met Boris Nemtsov's daughter, Vladimir Kuromisha, who's been poisoned twice. And the stories, we live in a country where people think they're folk heroes for refusing to wear masks in Sainsbury's. These people, Alexei Navalny, I mean, it is almost impossible to find the words to describe their courage. Actually, it is impossible. 11:30 is the time. Holly Harris is here with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
11:34 is the time. A little bit more on what it means to be poor in the UK in 2021. And I think, the 0-hour contract, pincer movement, and the gig economy, the idea that if you have a job, but if your employer doesn't need you today, you get nothing, coupled with the astonishing terms and conditions that many people working hand to mouth endure. I will never forget being told firsthand of a bloke who broke his leg, and if he couldn't find somebody else to drive the van delivering white goods with another bloke, so it was a two-man team, if he couldn't find somebody else to do that, then he would end up losing money every day because he was still in hock to the company he ostensibly worked for the van that he couldn't drive because he'd broken his leg. I mean, it is really as if everything got turned upside down, and legislation ideas that were brought in to protect workers or to provide a little bit of space, a little bit of a deregulated workplace. They all love it so much, those secretly funded shills and think tanks. Turns out it's actually really, really, really benefited capital, by which I mean not necessarily even people who run businesses, but people who invest the money in the businesses and then just sit back and wait for the returns to come rolling in. But hey-ho, Doff Cat, Tog Forlock, Vote Rees-Mogg. Patrick's in Bath. Patrick, what does poor mean in the UK in 2021?
Poor means not having what you need to support yourself, whether that be to feed, clothe, pay your bills, look after your children, and even get your children to school. I speak as somebody who works for Universal Credit, and I talk to claimants every day. It doesn't just mean that. It means people who have been in high-earning jobs who, as a result of lockdown, can no longer work in those positions. People who work on contracts. I think of one claimant who works as a deep-sea diver.
Yes.
He cannot currently work. He is self-employed, therefore he has to pay the taxman. He has children, and he has no income. His savings get eroded as he attempts to support himself until he no longer has savings through no fault of his own. And he comes to the state looking for help,
yes,
and is astonished to find that help is what it is.
Astonished because partly, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but if I were trying to work out why he would be astonished, it's because we live in a country where people seeking social security have been portrayed as living the life of Riley for the last 30 years.
People talk about claimants having flat-screen TVs, plasma screens, Virgin. Everybody has that these days. Everyone has got a flat-screen TV. I've got a flat-screen TV.
I don't know if it's possible to buy a TV that doesn't have a flat screen. My recent trips to the tip or the dump, they're piled up. They're 6 feet high piles of flat-screen TVs that people don't want anymore. But you know, they'll move on to something else. You can usually get an idea of what poor British people will be denied by looking at what refugees are being denied today. So smartphones, I think, are the new flat-screen TVs, aren't they?
I do talk to claimants, and one of the things I hear repeatedly is that sense of shame.
Yes.
They feel. In talking to claimants,
yes,
I'm a voice talking to them. They will never meet me. I will never see them face to face.
No.
But I get to speak to them at a most vulnerable and anxiety-inducing part of their lives. I can't know the full circumstances they live under. I do require to know information about their lives so I can find out what help I can extend to them, or Universal Credit has a capability to extend to them. And some of those conversations I am very privileged to have, and I get to talk to some incredible, wonderful people.
Well, I hope you'll allow me to say they're lucky to have you at the end of the phone. That won't be the experience for every Universal Credit applicant. And
perhaps.
I hesitate to ask you this because, again, I'm conscious of how voyeuristic it can sometimes seem, but I think we trust each other, and the massive majority of people listening to the programme trust me. So how do you define the bare minimum? When you talked at the outset of not being able to provide the basics, how do we define the basics, Patrick?
The basics, as Universal Credit determines it, is in terms of entitlements. And one could talk about how I talk about it is above the line and then below the line. Above the line, we talk about your entitlement as, say, a single claimant or as a couple. We then talk about your age. So you had a claimant, or you had a chap there who was 24.
That's right.
If he was 20, he would have received £342 per month as a 24-year-old. If he was 25, he would have earned, or he would have received £409 as an entitlement.
It's just arbitrary, isn't it?
Why there's a difference, heaven knows. We then talk about accommodation. He said his rent was not covered by Universal Credit. There's something called the shared room rate. If you are below a certain age, then the government determines that you should be sharing with friends, I guess.
Oh, I see. Right. And if you're not, unlucky. You better hurry up and change.
if you have housing costs, if you rent, grand. If you're on a mortgage, you find yourself, and if you don't have the wherewithal, you find yourself on a 9-month wait before the government can extend help to you. And that is an interest-free loan to cover your mortgage interest only. If you're lucky enough to live at home with mum and dad,
yes,
or what have you, then there's no housing costs that are payable in universal credit.
In the context of environmental issues, but by which I don't mean green issues, I mean the environment in which we're all living, albeit that days like today, Patrick, I think we feel further apart from some of our neighbours than ever. But what are your biggest obstacles or enemies? What is it that you find most frustrating about the environment that we have created in this country with regard to the people coming to you for what they deserve, actually?
People who've paid their taxes,
yes,
their national insurance, what have you, their pride to find themselves in a situation that they didn't predict or ever expect that they would be in. I formerly worked in a salaried role, yes, where I was quite a high earner, and I had my little cash of savings going on, and I could budget effectively. A lot of people don't have that capacity because what comes in goes out. Yes. They have no margin. They because of the nature of the jobs that they're working in, they don't have a capacity to generate for themselves some kind of their own safety net. And then, say, if you were someone like me who did have that capacity to generate that safety net, you look after your own safety net until it's gone. And then you need help. But by that stage, you might have a world of hurt. You've got credit card bills building up. You have to take the kids to school. There's after-school clubs. You might have a child who has special needs. What help is available to you? That constant stress going on in the background, and then the fear of coming to universal credit because you're proud.
And that pride is it's a hard thing to pin down, isn't it? Because I'll tell you, Patrick, because you've been very honest about your past, and regular listeners to this program will know what I'm about to tell you now. Is that when my late father got made redundant in the very early 1990s, and he went to the job centre, not so much to because we needed the money from the Social Security payments, but because he wanted to find out what other training and what other avenues might be open to him. And I, as a teenager, 18-year-old idiot, was embarrassed. I felt shame, and he explained to me why he didn't. He said, "This is the deal I made when I went out to work at the age of 15." And he said, it not just for me when I'd need a bit of help and guidance, but if you didn't have a job, if you needed help, that's the social contract, that's the bond. Would it be hyperbole to suggest that it's at breaking point, or that it has already broken?
I think it's not at breaking point. I think the next few weeks, months, years,
yes,
there may well be a reframing of that debate.
In a better way, you think?
In a more wholesome way.
Yes, I do too, actually. And well, you carry on, you're the expert.
I wouldn't describe myself as an expert.
These things are relative.
But I get to talk to a lot of people who are experts.
Exactly, same here.
If you have invested in society,
yes,
by paying your national insurance, your tax, that is a well that you have paid into. If you want to be, as the overwhelming majority of people I talk to, they want to be effective members of society. They want to pay their tax. They want to pay their national insurance. Current situation is that for a lot of people, say they're on zero-hour contracts, or they have been furloughed, or their business has closed down. And there's a headline this morning, a train company advertised 400 posts, they got 400,000 applications. The competition for people trying to find any form of work is intense.
So the challenge is to once again to look up for solutions and responsibility rather than to start biting chunks out of each other and fighting over whatever scraps are left. That's a worry as well.
That there is an ethos, and this is going to sound a tad strange. Universal credit is a means-tested benefit.
Yes.
And there is an ethos there that the more you do for yourself, the more rewarded you will be. There's an element in universal credit called the benefit cap, whereby there's a perception that people are raking in shed loads of money. They're not.
No, I know that.
If you are working, then that benefit cap can be dismissed, depending on your circumstances, to encourage you to work more, to bring home more for yourself, until you get to that point where you are beyond a point where universal credit can help you.
Yes.
But to conceive that people are raking in heaps of shekels as a result of being on universal credit is
There's a brand new series, Trafficked, with Mariana Van Zeller, and it airs every Monday on the National Geographic Channel. It's an investigative look with unparalleled access to the underground and illicit world of smugglers. Mariana gains a unique level of backstage access, and the danger she puts herself in with each topical episode is incredible. In episode 1, Tigers, Mariana tackles what one of her sources calls the untouchable smuggling story. It's a black market for tigers and tiger parts that's so lucrative, so secretive, and so dangerous that few have attempted to uncover its ugly details. Mariana journeys far and near to meet these smugglers face to face. Brand new series, Trafficked with Mariana Van Zeller, airs every Monday at 9 p.m. on the National Geographic Channel.
utterly wrong.
But it's the only way you get the you get the balloon inflated, isn't it? The undeserving nature of it is the only way you can take it away from people who deserve it. And I'm joined now by a secretly funded shill from Tufton Street who will explain why none of this. Yeah, I'm joking. I'd rather listen to Patrick. Thank you, mate. It's 11:47.
Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, with James O'Brien.
It is 11:51. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And the question of what it means to be poor in the UK in 2021 has been answered in a dizzying variety of ways. I hope you've got a slightly better understanding of it. There is, once again, no pleasure whatsoever in seeing something come to fruition that we feared on this programme for a long time, which is that by demonising, if you like, the workless poor, you will eventually see, by a process of almost sort of toxic osmosis, you will end up denigrating the working poor. It's not new, as Marcus Rashford's mum could tell you, but the idea that if you play by the rules you'll be okay, of course, just isn't true. If you look at wage cuts, people, you can call it neoliberalism, you can call it what you want, but the idea that if you let business people make up the rules, if you let the market make the rules, then everything will be just fine, is the largest single reason why there is so much poverty around, and even people who are still keeping their head above water feel aggrieved and betrayed. And then, of course, along comes someone like Donald Trump or Nigel Farage to tell you lies about why you are not doing as well as you should be doing. And lo and behold, you cast your vote to make your life even worse, as indeed the fishermen are discovering today, a story we'll return to a little later in the programme. But there it is, that is how it works. And if you're there listening to this programme and calling people liars and saying, if you can't feed, don't breed, then your children will be next. This juggernaut of blame and unpleasantness will not run out of petrol. It has to be run off the road by clarity and leadership, strong politics, honesty. And in this country, at this time, with our newspapers doing what they do, well, don't hold your breath. 11:53 is the time. Let's look at the politics of this universal credit story now. There's a debate later today where the government will come under pressure to announce that the £20 a week extra universal credit payments currently in place because of the lockdown will continue beyond the 31st of March. The government, well, I shall invite our political editor, Theo Usherwood, to fill in the blanks. Theo, what's going on?
So the vote is going to be at some point after 7 p.m. This evening, and it's on an opposition day motion being brought by the Labour Party and there Keir Starmer, of course, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary Jonathan Reynolds, and it says that the government should reverse the decision to cut universal credit by £20 a week, or just over £1,000 a year on the standard rate, and that was the rate your previous caller mentioned, which is £342.72 for those single and under 25, and then single and over 25, it's £409.89. And of course, Rishi Sunak introduced the £1,000 a year uplift on those two amounts last March, just before the lockdown, to help families worst affected and claiming universal credit. And he said at the time it was only for a year. And of course, that year is coming to an end. Labour is making the argument that the effects of the pandemic are still ongoing. People are still financially suffering, and therefore the government should continue. Now, there is another option that's being talked about, which is a one-off payment of £500, which would in effect cover 6 months. But the problem with this option is that whilst the cost of the Treasury is only half keeping universal credit in place for a year, i.e. £3 billion rather than £6 billion, it is only a snapshot in time. So you might have a situation where somebody is entitled to universal credit now, they receive that £500, and then in 3 or 4 weeks' time, in a month's time, they find a new job that's actually lifts them out of entitlement to universal credit, but they've already got that £500. And of course, conversely, it works the other way, where you could have somebody who loses their job in a month's time, and therefore is entitled to universal credit. But if the government goes with this option, they'll be going back to the pre-COVID universal credit levels, rather than, and they won't receive that £500 one-off snapshot, that one-off payment, and therefore they'll be back on what the universal credit was, the standard rate was prior to the pandemic. Now, Conservative MPs like Jake Berry, he's the chairman of the Northern Research Group of Conservative MPs that, of course, won those red wall seats back in the 2019 general election, very conscious that they need to stay on side with their constituents, calling for the government to reverse the decision. They're also backed up by a man called Stephen Crabb, who's a former Work and Pension Secretary.
Didn't he have a tilt at the leadship 100 years ago?
Yeah, he did.
No, he did, didn't he?
He did. He was one of the outside hopefuls back when Theresa May won the leadership in post the referendum in 2016. He's also criticised the move. Interestingly, though, he's also criticised the £500 idea, the one-off payment idea, saying it's the wrong way to go. And there is a difference between the view in number 10, Boris Johnson, and of course the view in the Treasury led by Rishi Sunak. And there's still yet to be an agreement that's been reached. What I would say, just to add to that, is Nadhim Zahawi, the vaccine minister, he gave the government a bit of wriggle room this morning, because as well as defending the government, he also said that the Chancellor would be making an announcement in his budget on March the 3rd,
yes,
which would, of course, allow him to come back with an alternative that would be palatable to Tory MPs in northern constituents. That, of course, it's not just they that want to ensure that they keep their constituents on side. It's also number 10, because they were crucial to Boris Johnson winning that 80-seat majority back at the end of 2019. So at the moment, this is a way for the Opposition Day debate, is a way for Labour to highlight the problem. It's a way for them to try and drive a wedge between Conservative backbench MPs and the Conservative leadership, but it's a non-binding vote. Boris Johnson has tried to take the sting out of it by saying his MPs can abstain.
Will that work? Do you think that the abstention plus the 3rd of March wait and see pie will take the sting out of the Labour tactics or not?
It's a tactic that's often used when you have thorny issues brought up in opposition day debates, rather than whipping his MPs to support the government position, which is that universal credit is going to be cut by £20 a week, and then ending up in a situation where Labour MPs or Labour hopefuls at a general election can print up leaflets saying your MP, your Conservative MP, voted for this cut to
so
universal
the results,
credit.
the success or failure of the tactic will not be judged by the results of the vote today. It's an excellent point. Theo Ashwood, many thanks indeed. It's coming up to 12 noon. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've realised that perhaps we could have conducted... Well, I'm glad the conversation... I've found the conversation fruitful and fascinating, heartbreaking at times, of course, but the question of what difference 20 quid a week would make is one that perhaps we should have a look at as well. But I'm very keen to draw your attention to the fish as well, of course. 12 noon is the time.